And the video is on. So, hello, this is a new series that we are starting. It's a series about Indian consumer categories. So, let me start by clarifying what we are not. This is not a brand story. These are not campaign breakdowns. These are not quick takes. There are enough of those, and there are enough people who are possibly better at it than I am. For me, the attempt here is to understand how categories have evolved, and I'm talking about Indian consumer categories. We'll see if we can cover something else later on. So we look at what shaped them, what constrained them, and why they look the way they do today. Now we look at the historical aspect. We look at consumer behavior. We look at economics and a few turning points where things could have gone either way, but didn't. So this is the part that really interests me because I love counterfactuals. I understand that many things happen for a reason. Sometimes they are historical accidents, and thinking through why things happen and what could have happened is an interesting exercise, and I want to do this along with you. Now, this isn't meant to be definitive. I'm certainly not an expert. It's a learning exercise done out loud. If you are interested, so if you are interested in how everyday products quietly shape habits, markets, and behavior, you'll probably enjoy this. Now, before I start, a little bit about me. I'm Shashwat. I've spent a lot of time in B2C businesses, and for me this series is really a way to deepen the understanding because I've done a lot of running around but not really enough time. I've not spent enough time thinking about how these businesses came to be. So it's my way of learning. Essentially this podcast is for an audience of one, but if I find more people interested in this, and some of you will probably find this interesting, then uh, then great. So um, the focus here is on content, not me, so I don't want to spend too much time introducing myself. That's it. Um, so so episode 1 is around tea. Now tea feels inevitable in India, right? It's there when the day begins. It's there in offices. It's there on railway platforms. It's there on roadside stalls, and it cuts across class, region, language, and income in a way that very few products do. Now, because of that, we rarely ask a simple question: how did tea become Indian in the first place? Because it wasn't Indian to begin with, and more importantly, was this outcome inevitable? Because historically, culturally, and economically, the answer is no. India was not meant to be a tea drinking nation. Tea did not enter Indian life because it was desired, discovered, or culturally aligned. It entered because of a supply chain problem, survived because of habit, and scaled because taste was simplified. Now, once you see tea this way, the category stops looking natural and starts looking constructed. So this is what the first episode is about. We want to see how tea entered Indian market and how it became a part of everyday life. So going back right to the start, when tea plantations were established in India in 19th century, Indians were not the intended consumer. Tea was an imperial concern. Britain was heavily dependent on Chinese tea, and that dependence was risky, politically, economically, and strategically. So, going through their own phase of Atmanirbharta, they wanted to find um, ways of means of reducing that dependence. So, finding a way to grow tea outside China wasn't about expanding markets, it was about securing supply. Now, tea in India is associated with Assam. Assam mattered because it reduced a geopolitical okay, why am I saying vulnerability? Weakness is what I mean. Um, this starting point matters because it tells us something unusual about how the category was born. So production came before demand. It was important to find a place to grow, to fulfill the demand in Britain. So in India, there was leaf, there was land and labor, but there was no waiting Indian market because very few people in India at that time had experienced tea, right? So there was no cultural pull. There was no embedded ritual, and I'll tell you why I'm referring to rituals. Most consumer categories are built around rituals because that's how habit is built. We'll come to this part later, but it's important that at that time there were none. Now, at this point, a reasonable question arises. So, why would you want to create an Indian market for this anyway? Why can't you simply export all of this to Britain or Europe? And the answer lies in the way commodities work because there's very little differentiation. Your production often scales faster than consumption can absorb. Now, remember that tea in Europe was not just about providing Indian tea for European demand. You were also facing competition from China, right? So while you could scale production, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that all of this would service European demand. So, and this was also because not all tea produced met export quality standards. Export markets, therefore, tend to be volatile in ways that plantations cannot afford. Why? Because plantations have fixed costs, they have labor obligations and land, right? That cannot be easily repurposed. So you need consistent demand. Creating a domestic market, therefore, wasn't about culture or choice. It was about absorbing the surplus. So whatever was going into Britain was one part of the piece, and for whatever was left over from what was sent for Britain's demand was what you needed to find a market for, um, and therefore creating a market in India made complete sense because it would be the easiest to service, right? You would virtually be producing where you would ultimately service that demand. So it in that sense, Indian consumption wasn't the goal, but it was a solution to a problem that you had created once you started growing tea in India, right? Now, and this is something that we'll revisit across categories. How do you create consumers when none exist? In tea's case, you don't persuade them. You go about by placing the product inside systems they cannot avoid, right? So this is specific to tea's trajectory. Tea entered Indian life through institutions. So government of India and Britain had a big advantage. They had these big institutions of railways, factories, military, and offices, government offices. Now, these are environments with fixed schedules, right? They have predictable breaks, and they have a large number of people, right? So you have a big set of people, you have fixed schedules, and you have predictable breaks. Now, what you want to do is enter into these predictable breaks. So remember, I spoke about creating rituals. These breaks give you the chance to create rituals. Now, it's important to be precise about how this happened. There was no policy designed to make Indians drink tea, right? It happened in an organic way, but there was a situation that was there that enabled this to happen, right? So the state had this infrastructure, which is all these institutions, and these are disciplined workplaces with standardized times. Now, what entrepreneurs and intermediaries did was to fill those breaks with something that worked. So during break time, tea was served, right? And tea had certain advantages. Tea was cheap, it was available in volume, it was easy to prepare in bulk, it was mildly stimulating and non-intoxicating, and this helped, right? If it's a stimulant which is non-intoxicating, then that means you'll probably do your work much better, right? If it's easy to prepare in bulk, all the more great. If it's available in volume, then you service a lot more people. And if it's cheap, which tends to be a prerequisite for a mass product, then that's great. So tea wasn't mandated, it was selected again and again by solving certain practical problems. And once a behavior is repeated inside an institutional system, which is what happened, it stops feeling like a decision and starts becoming normal life. What do I mean? So you go to a office during breaks, you're served tea day after day after day. When you go through this, it becomes a habit, right? It becomes part of your life. So you might not have chosen tea because you liked it or loved it. it simply became part of your routine, and once it became part of your routine, you start to actively choose it even in situations outside of where you first encountered it. This is what you would call as a ritual. So this is how tea entered India. It entered through these institutions where it was served during these breaks, and because these institutions exposed tea to a number of people, many number of people, that possibly was their first exposure to tea, and they probably got used to it, and slowly the same tea therefore had conditions to enter Indian homes, because people were already exposed to it and it had become part of a ritual. But it did not happen. It did not happen immediately. So we'll go into how it happened. Now the sequence is crucial because remember, if tea had required persuasion, it wasn't as if there wasn't any competition. You would have competed with regional drinks, you would have competed with coffee, and it wasn't a foregone conclusion that you would have won it. So again, maybe some of it was was contrived, maybe some of it was accident, but through institutions, tea entered Indian life, and then the next part was entering Indian homes, right? And why I'm saying that there might be an aspect of chance here, because not every product that entered institutions did make an entry into Indian homes. So an example is Q9 drinks, right? Schwab's has a Q9 drink product. Now that hasn't scaled in India, right? It was served in canteens of these big institutions, but it did not become big in India. Tea did, right? Why? Because tea was different. Excuse me. Sorry, I have a bit of a cough, so you'll probably have to adjust for this episode. Hopefully, it gets better. So we'll probably and we'll probably do this much better over incoming episodes as I get more experience with this. So coming back to the topic, tea was different because it could be adjusted, it could be diluted, it could be sweetened, it could be made familiar, and this flexibility was important, right? Because it helped you cross a difficult line from the system, which was institutions, to the household. Now this is where many products failed. But really, to understand why tea made a place for itself in Indian homes, there are certain aspects of tea that you need to remember, right? And some of these are unique to the Indian market, some of the others are not. Now most tea that people drink in India is not from a single place, right? It's usually a mix of leaves from different regions and harvests. This process is what is called blending. So what people refer to as blending is basically a pack of tea having leaves from different regions and harvests. And there's a reason why this happens, because tea is an agricultural product. The taste changes with weather, season, and geography. And if tea were to be sold from a single source, then today's cup would taste different from last month's, right? So you want consistency. Any ritualized product needs consistency. So when you're forming a habit, you want to reduce variation. Blending smooths this out, right? So blending was one part. It allowed brands to deliver a cup that roughly tasted the same every day. Now consistency was one part, and there is one thing that I'll probably refer to in a future episode, which is that consistency in India became far more important than distinctiveness, right? It also allowed big brands to emerge. In certain markets, this hasn't happened. In markets like China, distinctiveness is still very important, which means region the type of tea that is drunk is often fragmented, and therefore it gives smaller brands a chance. Whereas whenever consistency and the degree of variation is narrow, big brands have a much bigger advantage. Scale matters, right? So in India, scale has become predominant. So one aspect was blending. We spoke about blending, um, and um, and while you can think that it was a deliberate decision taken only by brands, and that's how they helped in the evolution of the market, it's more likely that it's a pattern that they observed, that the market rewarded reliability and penalized surprise. So brands learnt and reinforced it. So Once a category trains consumers in this way, reversing is very difficult, right? So we'll come back to the consistency versus distinctiveness debate at a later stage. But blending, right? Blending is one aspect that helped um, tea crack the Indian homes. The other aspect was something called a strength, right? Strength is the way people evaluate tea in India. Now, what is strength? Before we come to that, typically you have tea with milk and sugar, right? Most tea is had with milk and sugar. Milk and sugar do more than soften bitterness. They make tea consistent. They soften the differences. They also make tea more economical. Now, when you have milk and sugar, especially milk, you need smaller amounts of tea in a single cup, and therefore you can have more number of cups. So it makes tea economical, makes it massy. It also fits into Indian kitchens because you already use milk and sugar, right? You use milk and sugar daily. But most importantly, and this is where we are coming to the strength part, it changes how tea is judged, right? Once milk and sugar is added, subtle differences matter less. There's a very narrow range within which the taste of the tea functions, and the only thing that remains noticeable then is strength. Now, what is strength exactly? It's not about bitterness, it's not about refinement. These are aspects related to it. Strength is essentially an answer to a simple question: does tea still feel present once milk and sugar is added? So there are certain aspects that people talk about when they measure strength. One is color. A strong tea looks darker. The second is fullness. So it should feel full in the mouth. It should be filling. The third is the aftertaste. It should linger after you drink it, and there should be cut through. Despite the milk and sugar, the taste should cut through. So these are the four aspects that people refer to as strength. And because you add milk and sugar, it's not the aroma or the subtle taste of the tea that's evaluated. It's basically this: it's color, it's fullness, it's lingering aftertaste, and the cut through. This is what tea is evaluated at. So therefore you've done two things. One is you've blended tea, and therefore the good goes with the bad to come up with an average. And the second is that you've added milk and sugar to narrow out the subtlety and the aroma and all of that. So therefore it's become a game of consistency. It's become a game of the same taste repeating day after day, month after month. So therefore what it gives you uh, is is basically a goal of consistency. And when you have consistency that you need to maintain over a big chunk of population, then that gives you scale, and that's where big brands emerge. So in India, strength is a very powerful signal. It's the main way in which the quality of tea is evaluated, and this did not need to happen, but it did. Indian market evolved that particular way. So what it did was, um, it allowed brands to solve a problem, which was to make tea predictable in taste and strength. Consumers did not want to evaluate every cup, right? They do that when distinctiveness is important. Here, consistency was so. It was only about taste and strength. So therefore, it's all about trust, right? Uh, Trust for who can give me that consistency, and brands became a shortcut for that trust. And therefore bigger brands have emerged. We'll cover the brands in more detail in a future episode, but what we are trying to do is explain why big brands emerged in India in the first place, right? It did not happen in certain other markets. For example, in China, there are many regional brands, and distinctiveness is important in that market. So I'll just do a quick summary. So tea became a daily non-negotiable habit because of institutions. Tea sat within a very narrow acceptable range because of the blending and the sugar and the milk. Consumers wanted predictability, not discovery. and therefore personal trust no longer mattered because it wasn't about distinctiveness, it was consistency. Therefore impersonal trust had to replace personal trust, and which is how big brands emerged. So this is how tea entered Indian homes. Now when we look at tea today, we tend to see culture. What's harder to see is structure, right? Tea became Indian not because it was chosen, because there was a way in which it entered the Indian life through institutions, and then the Indian homes by adaptation, by its adaptability, right? And once that happened, once you narrowed on how the product would be evaluated, um, it created conditions for brands to emerge. So this is what we wanted to cover in this episode. In the next episode we will look at things beyond this into what the habit actually means, right? We'll see how tea reflects class, control, comfort and identity in Indian life. uh, because once tea becomes invisible, it starts revealing far more than taste ever could, right? So that's what we'll try to cover in the next episode. If you've had the patience to come all the way till here, then thank you, and I hope you will have the patience for the next episode also. We'll try to keep it as detailed and as interesting as this one I hope was. So looking forward to seeing you again in the next episode.